Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from the Irish Education Group. My name is Tudor Williams, Chartered Fellow of IOSH and a member of the Irish Education Group, past committee member, and I'm pleased to bring you this presentation today on health and safety considerations for vulnerable groups. A little summary there of my background and experience. I really hope that 25 years of working specifically in the education and work-based learning sector, that I've got a lot of information and guidance that I can bring you. Probably far too much for an hour webinar, but there's opportunity for some questions at the end. And there's also opportunity hopefully for some follow-up post session, which I'll be discussing later on. I hope you'll benefit from my experience, and I hope you'll benefit from the presentation we're about to go through. This is a little outline of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to look at a little bit, just mention about the changing face of HSE guidance and our awareness, whether we see ourselves as safety professionals, practitioners, whether we're employers, whatever our interest in today's webinar, we need to be aware that HSE have spent a lot of resource and a lot of effort over the last few years to make certain that, for instance, in terms of vulnerable workers, the positioning of guidance, its objective in reducing bureaucracy can be seen exactly in just this one area that we're going to look at. The presentation today will have a specific focus on young people, apprentices, work experience, training providers, and employers and responsibilities. We're going to learn from case history. We're going to have a little look at some examples out there early on, and then come back to those at the end from our sector. I talk about the limitations of competence and the consequences of that, the need for clear management of our working arrangements and the importance of that to go forward, and a little bit of a chat about checks and records, their ownership, responsibility and liability. And I can safely say that due to all my experience and my current work position in the second point up there, the last 4 points are some things that I deal with virtually every day of my working life at the moment, and will continue to do. And I'll explain more of that as we go through. So if you simply, a couple of clicks will take you into the vulnerable workers website. It won't look exactly like that, but they are the 9 areas which is based around the pages on the site. 1 or 2 clicks will get you there. 9 areas under the heading of vulnerable workers. You'll see young people at work towards the bottom. But interestingly enough, if you were to look, for instance, at the heading gig economy, agency and temporary workers, you will see some very, very simple points there and responsibilities where people should take heed, is what I would say. Take care. If you're involved in placing in temporary workers, into anything to do with agency working, there is some things there which are absolutely critical to today in vulnerable workers, but certainly as well young workers, and also the general guidance you see on this page. Obviously an awful lot more to deal with than we could do in the time allotted today, but I hope I can make some strong links for you. And in a few slides time, we're going to have a little look at a little bit more about HSE's specific guidance and talk about interaction between the site as well, which I think is an important point to make. When we look at vulnerability, this is what I'm talking about. This is what fills, unfortunately, a lot of my time, is accidents and specifically deaths to young people. These 4 in particular, particularly the top 3, are very concerning to myself: safety professionals who work in our sector, employers, providers, work experience, and anyone who has an interest in looking after the health and well-being and protecting the lives of young workers. What I would say is that this is the consequence of the result of being vulnerable. What are the consequences of not following HSE guidance is a sort of key consideration here. I would say that Cameron, Tom, and Luke were all apprentices. James Roke wasn't. HSE described James Roke as young, but you'll see what we mean now by young when we look at some definitions. This is important to me to make certain that we look at definitions. I often find it a challenge when I do my work as a consultant in this field, and I get employees as to what they understand by young and vulnerable. Very often, they certainly don't know. You might find that people are knowledgeable of what a young person is as a definition on a HSE's website, as you'll see there, top right. They certainly are very ignorant, for want of a better word, I suppose, of vulnerable workers in terms of HSE's definition. And as far as on the left-hand side, dictionary definitions, if you like, we can dip into so many. I picked these out. And certainly as far as, if I went back one slide to James Roke, even by IOSH and HSE's reporting of this particular case, they described him as a young person. Now at 22, they wouldn't have described him as a young person by the HSE's definition, but they were describing him as a young person, being in an early period of life or growth or not old, in terms of that meaning. And it is really, really important to establish an understanding of vulnerability in all its forms as a hazard, and to fully evaluate, therefore, the risk it poses. Now, if we move on and just returning one quick comment to the HSE content changes and objectives and features. So I'm going to talk a bit later on about the Cameron Minshall case, but that was pre the changes that we have now under vulnerable workers. Yet it can quite easily be seen that some of the points that related to that case were well established on the HSE's website and other related websites. What have the HSE been trying to do with their changes? So if you were to look at the vulnerable pages, you will see that the layout of them and any particular link from the 9 areas tries to get a consistency of message, presentation and navigation. Certainly in my field, and certainly people would say in other fields as well, a reduction of bureaucracy through the simplification of messages. Very much a linking and what I call information loops, making it easy to stay in the website and not be drawn out of it and away from the main source of information. Reflection and reinforcement of consistent messages, that's key. That's certainly evident in the young people's pages. Now the changes to vulnerable workers guidance is almost 2 years old now. When I worked a little bit on that with the HSE, and I think it was launched about the August-September time 2 years ago. More recent examples of changes are RIDO, health and safety leadership and health and safety management are a little older. But if you were to look at the RIDO pages and then look at vulnerable workers pages, you would see certainly a consistency in layout. Why am I stressing that? Because everyone has to learn where the HSE are going on their changes. No one fully agrees with it. No one always understands the HSE have limited resource, but it is important as safety professionals and safety consultants that we impress on employers the ease and the correctness of finding the right information they want to be able to act on the guidance and then impact on policies, etc., and so on. Now, moving back into vulnerable groups and the guidance pages, in particular, we need to look at, say, consistency of messages across the vulnerable groups guidance pages. As I said, there is a consistency of message. I've already stated that. There may be multiple references to age, more detailed rationale as to what makes a person or person within a group vulnerable. So whether it be new and expectant workers, overseas workers, migrant workers, young people, lone workers, the word vulnerable comes up a great deal. There are other common themes, particularly to the importance of supervision, induction, training, and work instruction, which are going to be taking us through a great deal of what we're going to try to do in the next half hour or so. And then also the need to consider the importance of risk assessment and the responsibility for it and the detail of it, because there are key statements which I'm going to read out and show you which I still find today when I'm dealing with training providers in particular, that they fail to adhere to, they fail to understand, and it has implications. It certainly does. And there may be some questions you wish to ask later on, and I'll do my level best to get them in some sort of 5 to 10 minutes that we've set aside for that later on, or as we've stated, post presentation, where we can look at any questions we haven't got to. But these are absolutely key points. And why? After one of the particular cases, Cameron Minshall, the HSE basically tore up its website and presented a new website stressing particularly the importance of supervision, induction, training, and work instruction. It then went a stage further a couple of years later, but there was a catalyst for change in that particular case history, and that also fed in quite nicely, if you like, to the HSE's overall objective to reduce bureaucracy and to change the look and feel about its website completely. So these key features I'm going to highlight as we go through the following messages, particularly say on the next slide, where I impress on people when I work with training providers or say education establishments, everything from universities right down to those just providing work experience and sourcing apprentices and so forth. The HSE guidance is there for a reason. Read it and use it. The HSE would expect you to in a prosecution. They say you can apply and read other guidance if you wish, but they would expect you to be able to prove where that guidance has come from, its validity, its purpose, its application. And I say, don't reinvent the wheel. This guidance is here. Now you'll see things in quotation marks here. So I'm taking these statements directly from the HSE's website to establish my key understanding today. Now we're going from vulnerable workers, from the 9 areas, primarily into young workers here, but also I'll be making the case that they apply, as you'll see in a few slides time, what applies to the providers, what applies to employers, and where we go beyond that to talk about vulnerability in general. So HSE say many young people are likely to be new to the workplace and facing unfamiliar risks from the job and the surroundings. You should give them clear and sufficient instruction, training and instruction and supervision so they can work without putting themselves and other people at risk. So you can see, I'm not going to read every statement out to you, and you can certainly reflect these at your leisure after the presentation as well, by downloading it. But I would say, look at how often the key points I'm trying to raise are made here in the HSE's guidance: instruction, training, supervision, and interpretation, impression of what risk is. It flows through everything they say. And when we revisit some of the case histories later on, just some basic information, you will certainly see how paramountly important it is to preserve the health and well-being and the lives of young people, and particularly in the cases that I've looked at. It's telling us that young people need more supervision than adults, and that good supervision will help get a clear idea of capabilities and the progress of the job. Don't forget, these people are training, they're learning. It's part of what we want. It's part of our investment in young people, or a young person, even if not under 18, someone who is vulnerable, immature, new to the job. Even in their 20s or 30s, they're new to the job, they're vulnerable. And the point I'm trying to make, if we're investing in our time and money in that, we want a good person, well-trained, capable, and this is where it starts. If I take that a bit further now and explain similarly the HSE's guidance on vulnerability, young people, as they are likely to be new to the workplace and so therefore at more risk. Now, the HSE would say in the first 6 months of the job, I'm not going to argue that because some people might be more vulnerable on day one. They might be more. You cannot. There's no calculation. There's no method to that. But for as long as a person is under 18, they will be vulnerable. For as long as a person is under 18, they will be considered to be young. When they move beyond 18, they're not considered young as far as HSE is concerned, but they could still be vulnerable because they could be taking on new tasks. They could be taking on new responsibilities. They could be promoted. They could. So we have to consider they might move around in the job. The particular case, the particular case that we'll look at maybe later on if we have time, where it was not the first day of work of that particular person, but it was the first day of work at a place he hadn't been before, and therefore, we have to take into account the additional risk posed by that. Lack of experience, how do we define maturity? May not have reached physical maturity, they may lack strength, so we have to be careful with aspects of health and safety such as manual handling and lifting, to be able to make certain that we do not put vulnerable people at greater risk, but where their maturity and lack of strength counts against them. Being able to raise concerns is a critical thing for me. When I talk about some of the case histories later on, I'm going to come back to that. And the HSE also say on vulnerability that they may need additional support to allow them to carry out their work without putting themselves and others at risk, such as training and supervision. And again, I'll spend a lot of time with employers and providers on this to see what they understand by support, because I believe that the monitoring of apprentices, the mentoring of them, is extremely important. I cannot stress that enough, and how much it has had an impact in, I believe, some of the cases that we could look at in terms of the deaths to learners. But certainly when we look at accidents in general, which we just should be doing, there are many accidents to young people and to learners where I believe mentoring, I have one place where I work that have a stop work authority, and everyone has the ability to stop work if they believe it's unsafe. But I'm trying to stress the importance of starting work. How do we know it's safe to start work? How do we know it's safe to press that button on the machine? Are people wearing their PPE, PPC correctly? Do they understand who to report accidents and incidents to? Do they know who to report concerns to? Where do they go for first aid for help? When are their breaks? Everything that's implied in starting work it has an impact on vulnerability. Now then, let's talk a little bit more detail about where we as safety professionals and practitioners might impact on our own systems and procedures and effective risk management, and where we can influence that on other people as well. We could almost do an hour on this slide and the next slide, and then returning back to HSE specific guidance. I'm certainly not going to read all these out because you'd be grateful at that. But as you digest them, there may be some questions, and certainly there may be some things that we want to follow up later on. But quite simply, on the left-hand side, this is standard guidance that practitioners and professionals would give to employers, or expect employers, if we were evaluating their systems, to say, what are we already doing to reduce and control and mitigate risk? We should have systems in place. We should have procedures and arrangements that stem from that. They should be able to adequately direct the level of risk identified. We need to be knowledgeable of schemes and standards across the business, and monitor and review processes are part of a plan, do, check, act approach should monitor the effectiveness of the arrangements and groups. That's just good management practice. Now, on the other side of the equation, what more might we need to do to control the risk further, to be able to make certain that dealing with young people, apprentices, vulnerable people is far more effective? So I would say to you that we would focus on HSEs, the core requirements that are outlined in the vulnerable workers guidance. We need to build and evaluate the risk from that, build in rigor at key stages, particularly induction, end of scheme evaluation and feedback. We could look to demonstrate and review ownership from the board level, a commitment there. I run IOSH courses for apprentices. I stress the importance of having not someone from the training department to back me up, but someone from the safety team or someone from a director level who can open or close that course. We need to review the relationship between providers and employers and involve learners as appropriate. I often find that the gaps are too big. We take too much for granted. The scale is too big. The numbers are too big. The inexperience of people doing checks and working with employers is not, communication isn't good. And there's a poor culture generally. And the further things we could do is check and change induction programs as often as is necessary. Training, instruction, and supervision to reflect additional risk controls, which are based on age and vulnerability and not just a general position, a general company position. Now, if we take that a stage further and look to see how that would impact on the assessment of risk and effective controls, bearing in mind that the lack of assessment of risk or the lack of effective controls is more likely to lead to an accident or injury to a young person or a vulnerable person, and even in the cases to their death. Now, again, time is against us to go into this area in great detail. So on the one side, again, I'm talking a little bit about management systems, but I'm being a little bit more specific here in terms of risk, dedicated health and safety resource, something that can impact on job and task location risk assessments, whether that be internal or in some cases external consultancy, make certain that it is effective within our management system. And again, the plan, do, check, act approach. Make certain that we have a commitment to train and competent workers across the business anyway, and that doesn't matter whether it's an employer or a training provider. Workplace and job instruction is almost a throwaway term. We would take it that we do it. We would take it that it's part and parcel of what we do, but we always need to make certain that it is effective within a whole system. Does it convey our policy? Does it convey our commitment? Does it convey how often we review in effect, and so on and so forth? The cyclical approach. And everything on this left-hand side is about that: mentoring, supervision, and effective procedures. Now, then when we swing over to the right-hand side, I could probably put a couple, 2, 3, 4 slides on this. I'm going to summarize. We need, when we consider based on our standard risk assessment format, where it asks us to consider, is there more that we need to do to control risk further and reduce risk to an acceptable level? I've put some general statements in here. We need to recognize any limitations of competence in our system, our procedures, our arrangements, and our competence to be able to deliver. Now, that may be a formal or informal gap analysis. We certainly need to identify that we have vulnerable and or young people as part of a permanent or temporary workforce. And we certainly need to adjust all parts of the health and safety management system, but particularly the doing bits, the acting bits, if you like, applicable to the degree of risk. Now, as you'll see in the next few slides, the HSE are, they want us not to be over bureaucratic and not do too much based on limitations of risk and based on evaluation of risk. So we will explore that now and see. But this to me is an absolutely key slide, and one that could be explored a great deal more. In terms of the last 2 slides, a summary point, what's on the left-hand side is all about underpinning management systems, whether we be the employer, whether we be the provider, the work experience provider, the apprenticeship agency, it doesn't matter. We need, as employers, to be responsible under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, and then to understand through that all the guidance that applies. On the right-hand side on both slides are all those little bit extras that we should be able to consider as a competent company and a competent person to be able to do, to make certain that we have a whole and holistic approach. Now then, let's break that down just a little bit more now in terms of what the HSE define as a responsibility for assessing risk. Too often, and still today, I find that that workplace providing agencies, employers, all of that side of it are too readily prepared to go into an employer and ask to see a risk assessment, and then evaluate the risk assessment, take a copy away with them, even If employers don't have risk assessments, provide them with pro forma risk assessments, and that just shouldn't be happening. It says, as the work experience organizer, you should take reasonable steps to satisfy yourself that any work-related risks to a student are managed by the employer. You undertake reasonable checks, kept in proportion to the risks involved, and you should not second guess the employer's risk assessment and procedures. Talking to them will help you identify workplace or tasks that will not be suitable for certain students. Now, I have nothing against recording our conversation, recording our findings, but that is totally different than doing it for the employer. The employer, as an employer, under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the management of health and safety management regulations, should see that as an employer, you should already be managing any significant risk for all workers, and you should therefore not treat young people, vulnerable workers, people on work experience, any differently. You should assess any additional factors if you employ a young person, such as the health and safety condition, which may be affected by the work or the work environment. So what we're doing now, just to take stock, is we're still in the 9 areas under vulnerable workers. We are under young people, and these are the differentiation within that one particular block of the guidance between for education and learning support providers and employers. But actually taking reasonable checks or reasonable checks or talking would apply if we were talking about agency or gig workers, if we were talking about lone workers, whatever, which are other areas within the 9. And certainly for employers, we need to be managing any significant risk for all workers in the workplace. So one of the 9 is new and expectant mothers. Another one of the 9 is immigrant workers or lone workers, etc. The fact is, our risk assessment should be able to stand up to the test of whichever group they're applied to, and as per the previous 2 slides, amended or adjusted where we begin to experience workers in a particular field. And again, just to go a little bit further in terms of roles and responsibilities, in terms of risk assessments, again, education and learning support providers, the HSE specifically say, do not introduce unnecessary additional paperwork that could lead to employers being discouraged from offering placements. It is likely to be far more informative to talk with the employer about what work the student will do, what the relevant precautions are, and the planned arrangements for, again, there's keywords, induction, training and supervision of the student. Now, a lot of these words are interchangeable. We talk about student, we talk about learning support providers, we talk about anyone where on this left-hand side, there is a responsibility for their learning, whether they be apprentices, work experience, even even classed as a child under 16 on work experience. We're not just talking about 16 to 18, so 18 plus, we could be talking about 14 to 16-year-olds as well, getting short-term work experience placements, even in a family business or whatever. And certainly on the employer side of it, again, the reiteration of the point, it says that what you cover in your risk assessment depends on the level of risk. I think as practitioners and professionals, we'd certainly understand that. You should review your risk assessment before they start. If you do not currently employ a young person or have not employed a young person in the last few years, are taking on work experience student for the first time, or taking on a work experience student with particular needs. If you have employed a young person on work experience in the last few years, don't repeat your risk assessment if the new student has a similar level of maturity and understanding with no particular additional needs. Now, I would say here, there's a lot of emphasis here on work experience. But my argument would be that you could be an employer who is taking on people who are vulnerable, that are not young, they're not on work experience, you're just employing them. And you may then go to a learning support agency to provide that, to provide their training on-site or off-site, online or otherwise. But that new person to your workplace is vulnerable. Now, there is too many instances of the people on the left-hand side asking the people on the right-hand side to do specific risk assessments for young or vulnerable people or learners, purely to satisfy the demand for paperwork, and that is not what this is about. This is where the HSE, through the Vulnerable Workers website, are trying to reduce bureaucracy, and it is wholly wrong to do that. I will not deny there are certain special circumstances in high-risk areas where individual and specific risk assessments are done, and I would go out of my way to say I can see some justification for that. But the general run-of-the-mill is what we see on here, is the basic information and approach that we should be applying. As I said, those last 2, maybe 4 slides we could spend an awful lot of time on, but you know, we're towards the latter half of my presentation now, and I want to leave some time for some questions. In terms of the limitation of competence, this is a key thing and a key contributor in some of the cases we're going to look at. We must recognize the lack of competence. We must understand what competence means. We understand what training and information and instruction people need. In the days gone by where I first cut my teeth in this industry, working for the LSEs, primarily in London, some 20 plus years ago, we delivered recognized certificated training courses demanded for and paid for by the Old Learning and Skills Council in England and by the techs, as they were in Wales and even in Scotland. We delivered. Just because those courses aren't demanded anymore, it does not mean there is a lack of a need for competence for people who work with employers. The fact is the whole approach to it has changed now. We need knowledge and understanding of work environments and hazards. We need to know how to reduce controls and how controls should be reduced. And that is enough of a reason not to risk assess an employer's workplace and advice. Knowledge is one thing, but over applying that knowledge and understanding, particularly where we don't have it, is not enough, is a good enough reason not to do it, apart from the fact that HSE tell us not to do it. Competence must extend to a responsibility on all parties to be organizationally as well as individually competent. And there's no harm in testing and checking that. There's no harm in a provider trying to know that it feels that an organization is going to work with is a competent organization, how it gets to. But that should not come from a forensic analysis of their health and safety policy and indeed their risk assessments. That's not what it's about. But the lack of competence, of course, is an obvious limitation for a young and or vulnerable person. And how is that being addressed is a critical factor in competence. And a lack of competence on both sides is and was a key factor in the deaths that we've already mentioned. And I say an absolutely a defining factor, and I have no hesitation in reminding all the people I work with of that on a regular basis. Now, I mentioned Cameron Minshall at the start of the presentation as one of 4 particular deaths that had happened. So here's some facts about that. Some people already know, some people may have been on webinars and seminars face-to-face with me over many years when I've dealt with this. He was a 16-year-old apprentice and he died 34 days into his first job. And he was drawn into the revolving chuck of an unguarded CNC lathe revolving over 700 RPM. And he suffered a massive cranial trauma and died of heart failure in the air ambulance. It was a unique case. His employer and training provider were both prosecuted. I only have one recollection of that happening prior to this case, and I have no recollection in the case of an apprentice death or a young person work experience death of it happening since. And I have an immense amount of detail on this case, as you'll see shortly. The only safety instruction Cameron was known to have received was a yellow post-it note on his machine stating, "Roll your sleeves up." Now, comments from the judge which underpin the vulnerability as a consideration, and I have to stress at this point, these comments were made before the vulnerability web pages were developed. we've always talked about vulnerability. We've talked about young people. They've always been there, but weren't there 7 years ago when the court case happened in the same format that we see them now. So please don't think that. But certainly the points are very pertinent. The judge said that he was inadequately trained, inexperienced, unqualified, unsupervised, and also apprentices were left to their own devices. And of the training provider and the employer, the judge said your health and safety policy should be seen as a promise. Now, my belief is that the health and safety policies of both the employer and the provider should be the vehicle to set out the requirements to manage risk and to risk it to any vulnerable group. There is no harm in asking an employer if their policy, their arrangements and procedures extend to young people, vulnerable groups in any capacity that we wish to assess that. Just reminding the employer as part of a learning agreement, a part of a contract, that this should be the case is really the way to be going. It should arrange and organize and drive all the processes, and there's no harm in being satisfied with that. It is the route to clearly managing all our working arrangements, to reducing risk, and of course to reducing the vulnerability of young people and any other group for that matter. So a further take on Cameron's competence and Cameron's case, just to split it into two areas. In terms of supervision, training and instruction, Cameron was supervised by more experienced apprentices, time served only. 2 apprentices had to hold Cameron's body up at his machine to be able to wait for someone to switch the machine off while the machine was switched off. It was a horrendous case. And I only throw that in there to say that, you know, we're talking about mental health awareness. People aren't that young that they can't be affected by mental health and affected by stress and overbearing work procedures and considerations in the workplace. Hazards were known to those with authority to control them, but there was an absence of control. So this contributed to the prosecution of both parties here. And it doesn't matter whether it was training, instruction, or monitoring. There were no clear processes existed. And Cameron was the victim of clear needs being overlooked through ignorance and blurred lines between the employer and provider. Now, it did not need the provider to do it for the employer. It only needed the provider to get an understanding of what the employer understood themselves about safe management and safe control of the working environment. They would have quickly understood that they didn't know that and didn't understand that, and therefore Cameron would not have been placed there in the first instance, is my firm belief. So effective information, instruction, training, and specifically supervision, bearing in mind you would need to be a competent supervisor in any proportion, in my view, would have likely saved Cameron's life. And in terms of competent arrangements, well, look, there was certainly a requirement for competence systems, and these were not understood and they weren't demonstrated. Policies, arrangements, and risk assessments, they were either non-existent or they were out of date, ineffective, and there was a poor lack of communication contributed here. No definition of roles and responsibilities on any real part of the provider or the employer, and competent arrangements should have allowed identification of the key requirements for organizational, contractual, and operational issues. I'm just going to move on. I don't fall behind. I'm just a minute or two off my schedule at the moment and say, look, there were 2 other cases I mentioned earlier, which really hammer home the importance of the vulnerable workers pages. Tom Owen, and I have to say these have not come to court. They have not been in court. I would expect them to. There are no prosecutions in this case. The comments related to Tom Owen come as a result of the inquest. But Tom Owen was 21 and working for Western Power Distribution in a trench where the incident happened in January 2017. The inquest heard he had previously failed a test for working with live wires and was using the wrong safety equipment on the day he died. He didn't even have the correct PPE. The coroner said there was no real training or supervision. The jointers know their job and they show apprentices how to do it. Showing my age, we used to call it sitting next to Nelly. That was a very old term that grandparents and great grandparents used to use, but it is still very appropriate. That's how he was shown the job. It is striking that they don't see themselves as supervisors. They have no training as supervisors and no refresher courses, and a jointer could be proficient, but not proficient at teaching. And there are great implications there in the Tom Owen case for supervision, instruction, information, and so on. Luke Wheaton, 16-year-old, when he was among 4 people who killed in an explosion at a wastewater plant. The other 3 were killed. One was a contractor working at the site and 2 employees of Wessex Water, and Luke was an apprentice. But the workers who were killed were using a disc grinders on the silo. Sparks from the work may have ignited an accumulation of methane gas in the top of the tank. And Luke was probably in his first week of work. And we have to ask ourselves, if we as a training provider were okaying the funding of the training for someone like Luke Wheaton, would we have known, is it possible to know that that young lad would be expected to do and go into such a dangerous operation in his first week of work? We wouldn't have needed to see the risk assessment. We could have simply asked, what was the learner going to do? Simple dialogue, simple information, simple conversation might have saved Luke Wheaton's life. We will probably find out, because I would expect that that will come to court at some particular point. Just coming to a close, I want to try to end on a positive note. Look, we have to talk about case studies, and we have to look at the worst case scenarios. And there are many other cases which are not where apprentices, young people or vulnerable people have died, but there are still many, many accidents to them. The role of practitioners and professionals, as I see it, is you have to be knowledgeable of standards and guidance. Hopefully today has helped you a little bit on that. Study it, have a look at it, work your way through the pages, know what's there, know how it works, know how to communicate it, understand the guidance, apply it proportionally as the HSE would have you do it, and responsibility to make certain that we meet our legal obligations. What we're reading is not law, it's guidance on how to help us to meet the law. And that's exactly the same for the business. Businesses need to be competent, they need to have competent people, and or show where they're getting competent advice from, internally and externally. And we should all be, as I said earlier, singing off the same hymn sheet and not reinventing the wheel. The businesses must recognize limitations and engage those who cover specialist areas. A couple of things on concluding messages. Look, being young makes you vulnerable, but so does inexperience. Lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of training, supervision and mentoring, and that can apply to anyone at any age. Just look at the government of the day. Lots of initiatives to try to get people off benefits into work. These people could be 30s, 40s, even 50s. But if they've not worked for a long time, they're going to have a period where they're going to be vulnerable. Why? Because they'll have lacked training, they'll have lacked instruction, information, and knowledge about the job. They will certainly need supervision, but they might need more continued mentoring, particularly as people sometimes feel disadvantaged in the workplace, threatened in a way by more experienced people. We just have to keep balancing these things up and have programs to deal with it. Risk assessments on whichever side of the fence we fall have to recognize what more is needed. Allow for existing controls to be extended to meet additional or changed working arrangements. And those changed and additional changed working arrangements are basically what the HSE guide us through their pages. I got, talk about linking and guidance. Just one thing on the health and safety for gig economy and agency and temporary workers. The HSE go out of their way to say, in practice, the day-to-day responsibility for health and safety during the work assignment lies with the end user business, because they will direct the work and may also control the premises where it takes place. They are therefore in the best position to manage health and safety of the worker. But then it goes on to say, before placing the worker with the end user business, the supplier must ensure the identified risks have been controlled and obtain clear information on their duties, skills, experience, qualifications required for them to do the job safely. The identified risks and control measures in place, including health surveillance where relevant, and clear guidance on how to raise health and safety concerns in the workplace. And that's under gig economy, agency and temporary workers, not young person. There is a clear overlap throughout the vulnerable workers pages of a great deal of interaction to make certain that we as training providers sometimes need to take a step back and say, this is what you need to be doing, employer. We're not the ones to do it for you, but we need to have a clear understanding that we're not controlling, dictating, confusing to add levels of unnecessary bureaucracy. And certainly I find the paperwork and systems generally, where they are used and they shouldn't be, are out of date and they're not fit for purpose. It is more about systems and management than it is about paperwork just for paperwork's sake. My final slide before we go into some, hopefully some questions, would be to say to you this. DTT, myself, and my fellow director, my wife was present on all 5 days of the Cameron Minshall court case. We obtained extensive information under Freedom of Information request, and the degree of liability on both parties was extensive. And we review other tragic cases and consistency, the same concerns, whether they're deaths or just accidents. Certainly in the case of both Luke Wheaton and Tom Owen, we've looked extensively at what is available at the moment, and we wait to see where that goes. Always our key findings, but always the key messages we take out in our work is this. We learn so much from the cases, and we as safety professionals want to take that to as many people who are prepared to listen in as many different means and ways as we can. On my experience, up to that point and beyond, we've changed, but also the HSE changed because they changed their guidance. They stripped it down. We talked to them about it. We talked to the police. We talked to HSE. We talked to everyone that was involved in it, and the HSE made their changes. And the key things were that it showed that there were blurred lines and ownership of arrangements and responsibilities, overburdensome records and unnecessary demands for information, a lack of competence or competence overextending itself, ignorance of simple guidance, leading to sort of flawed and incompetent behaviors and decisions, and therefore the unnecessary deaths of young and vulnerable people, specifically Cameron. I can only surmise both that all of that last paragraph there would have been similar for both Luke Wheaton, Luke Wheaton, Tom Owen, and the other gentleman's name that Mrs. James Roke, who died when he was crushed by an excavator on his first day on the particular site. And if you take anything from this particular presentation, excuse me, that last paragraph was true of the death of Cameron after the court case, when the HSE changed their guidance, and it is as true as it stands today, which I can back up through more of my day-to-day work. There is still, therefore, an awful lot to do. Now then, I'm bang on time, which is not normal, but as a live seminar, I'm pleased that I am. I can see there are lots of questions in the Q&A box. We've got sort of 10 minutes before we close. I'm going to try to go through some of your questions. On the screen there, you'll see my contact details. I'm not overly trying to sell anyone anything. Please don't visit our website at the moment because it's under repair and review. So if you need any contact with me, there's my details. I will be saying that whatever we can't get through in the Q&A or whatever else has come up will be reviewed by IOSH, fed back to me and to the IOSH education group, and we will make every effort to make certain that updated information and guidance where we can and within reason is made available to you post webinar. Let's have a little look at see what's in the Q&A box. If I think some of these answers are going to, some of these questions are going to take longer answers, to be fair, I may move on, and we see where we go. HSE state on their advice to schools and colleges is that schools and colleges have no responsibility in health and safety law for work experience students. The employer responsible for workplace health and safety. Yes, they certainly do state that. Whilst conceptually this makes sense, it seems a misleading and helpful message for schools, as they should be taking reasonable checks on employer, passing on relevant information about the student to the employer, and advise on the suitability of a student for a particular placement at HSE state, and supporting the student with any pastoral concerns. Would welcome your thoughts. Okay, look, they do say that the responsibility is with the employer. There is no doubt about that. In the Cameron case, there was a prosecution against the training provider as well. That was because the training provider, Sarah Taylor, who was the HSE inspector, said organizations that place apprentices with employers should make checks in proportion to the level of risk present in the workplace. Line People Training Solutions, they were the training provider in the Cameron case, placed Cameron at Huntley Mount Engineering, which was the employer, without conducting even basic checks to ensure that it was safe and healthy environment for any worker, especially a 16-year-old boy. And the thing is, there needs to be a balance. Okay, there needs to be a balance. The HSE state that you shouldn't do anything at all, but you should not do the employer's work for them, and the lion's share of the responsibility will always be, although there is case history with line people, will always be on the employer. Let me see. In the case of vulnerable students, as described in KCSA and working together to safeguard children, this is something the school still has a duty to oversee. Yep. Again, you need to be competent enough to interpret the guidance in your sector that tells you what you must do and strike a balance between them. No guidance will tell you to ignore your responsibility completely, and no guidance will tell you to do the employer's job for them. You have to strike a balance of understanding. Very informative. Thanks, okay. Many schools will identify the vulnerable students that may need additional support. Yes, that is absolutely imperative, and that needs to be a collaborative approach between the training provider, whether it's a school or any educational establishment, to make certain that the employer is aware of increased levels of vulnerability for whatever reason. Hi, Tudor. As you know, young people today are suffering more from mental health. The number of accepted home universities applicants through UCAS who declared, so that's got off my screen, declared a disability related to their mental health increased, right? What advice would you give to support those vulnerable workers? I'm not going to dodge that one. I will promise whoever posts that question, I will get some additional advice and guidance to you. That's quite a big subject to be going into at this stage. How do you balance assessing an employee with a medical condition from a health and safety perspective and their actual fitness to work role? I'm going to roll that into the previous question. I'm sorry, people will be disappointed if I don't give a direct answer to that, but there are quite a lot of wide and specific undertakings which I think need direction on that one. Again, related to COVID, children hadn't had any educational psychologist support. Again, it's a huge, huge area and a huge undertaking. And I do understand, as it says there, as an employer, we're having to we're to do these where we think they were needed. However, employers don't necessarily have an awareness of SENS, so may not be able to protect these young people. I quite agree. There is a big gap in my experience of the employer's understanding of these schemes and these requirements. If it was as clear as you don't need to assure yourself of a work experience organizer that employer has carried out a risk assessment, which includes the risks to vulnerable workers, then why doesn't the HSE clearly state that? I am not going to hide behind the fact that I 100% agree with the wording of the HSE's guidance and its clarity. I think it is try to reduce bureaucracy by saying specifically where the responsibility needs, But what it's done is it's come away from the links, I believe, that used to exist on the website to maybe some specific sector or contractual guidance. It's left all that behind. I still have regular conversations with the HSE person responsible for the website, and we continue to bring these points to their attention. I will make certain, I can promise you 100%, that anything that comes up in this conversation, boxes, chat or questions, which I think are for their attention, will be brought, will be done so. So please be assured that I do think there should be a need for some more clarity and explanation. I work for a construction training provider, and we place we place apprentices and subcontracted colleagues. How far should we go regards due diligence with relationship management at the colleges? Well, look, you know, the big test in the Cameron case was that paperwork and systems on both sides were wholly inadequate and could quite easily be pointed out. I think the slides I put up about our management systems and the Plan, Do, Check, Act approach and the need for a thoroughness to overview processes is part of the answer there. We shouldn't have paperwork for paperwork's sake. We should have a system that works and be satisfied that competent people have tested that to know that it would work. If you don't have specific risk assessments covering young or vulnerable persons, how do you demonstrate to parents what hazards and controls their family member might be exposed to? That is a very good point. The HSE go out of their way to say you shouldn't have specific risk assessments. And I don't believe that you need a risk assessment, but there is no harm in you drawing up documents that cover advice and guidance and certain working conditions which can be put out there in terms of advice. And I will clarify that, as I said, later. There are a lot of questions, not too many to get through. I'll take this last one. I love this one, obviously, super thing. I'm not reading it up because it says thank you. I'm just to see if there's a point there. All have individual risk assessments completed as per their own individual needs. And luckily, we have experience of SEND, which does help. Look, it's a case of what we call people. I'm working with a company at the moment where I'm pleading with them and we're getting there not to call things risk assessments when they're not risk assessments. Advice and guidance and supportive documents are key, and we should be careful on terminology. Look, I need a couple of minutes to allow IOSH to close the session and run a poll. We will take everything that's in the boxes. Can I ask you please to give your feedback on the webinar poll? It helps us all, education group, IOSH and myself, move forward. I'd like to thank you very much for such a great attendance today, great participation in the chat box and Q&A. Rest assured, we will follow up on anything and everything we can. Please be safe. Please look after all those people you're tasked with looking after, and remember those sad cases and realize there are many, many risks out there for our young people and vulnerable people, and there's a lot of hard work to do to make certain they're effectively protected. Thank you all very, very much for your support and participation today.